The old house loomed over Harbinger Lane. It stood like a skeletal giant under the pale moonlight. Twisted branches scraped against its boarded-up windows like bony fingers. They cast long, eerie shadows across the overgrown lawn. The house had been empty for as long as anyone could remember. Locals whispered tales of its dark past, but no one dared to venture near, especially not at night.
Why am I doing this? I know I should turn back. I know this is a bad idea, but the thought of the game, it beckons me closer.
Seth shivered, pulling his jacket tighter. He stood across the street, hidden in the shadows of a gnarled oak tree. His heart pounded against his ribs. He took a deep breath and stepped out of the shadows. He started across the street, his sneakers crunching on the fallen leaves. Each step was hesitant, a battle between curiosity and fear. He glanced up at the house, his eyes searching the dark windows. He could almost feel the house watching him.
I've come too far to turn back now. This is all for the sake of adventure, right?
Seth swallowed hard, pushing down the fear that threatened to choke him. He just had to remind himself why he was here. This was all for the sake of adventure, right? Seth's bedroom was a disaster zone. Clothes were strewn across the floor, comic books formed precarious towers on his desk, and video game cartridges littered every available surface. But Seth didn't care. His room was his sanctuary, a place where he could escape into worlds of adventure and excitement. Tonight, however, his sanctuary felt more like a cage.
It's just a game, right? Just a stupid game, but why does it feel so different?
He paced back and forth, his gaze darting between his window and the dusty box in his hands. It was an old Nintendo 64 console, a relic from his dad's childhood. But that wasn't what held Seth's attention. It was the game cartridge tucked inside. The cartridge was grey and unmarked, except for a single word scrawled across it in black marker: Nightmare.
Nightmare? What kind of game is this?
Seth's fingers traced the word, sending shivers down his spine. He had found the console and the game in the attic earlier that day. A strange sense of foreboding had washed over him as soon as he touched the cartridge. His best friend Tommy had dared him to play it.
It's probably haunted or something, Tommy said. I bet you won't even make it past the first level.
Tommy, the king of double dares, who never took a dare himself. Seth knew it was a stupid dare. He knew he shouldn't do it, but something about the game, about the mystery of the unmarked cartridge, drew him in. He wanted to prove Tommy wrong. More importantly, he wanted to prove something to himself.
The haunted house, the house where the game supposedly came from.
He glanced out the window. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow on the old house at the end of the street. The haunted house. The house where the game supposedly came from. The air inside the house was thick with the smell of decay and dust. Moonlight filtered through cracks in the boarded-up windows, casting long, dancing shadows across the floor. Seth crept through the house, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear the wind whistling through the broken windows. The sound sent shivers down his spine.
This place, it feels like a tomb.
He had found the old console in what was once a living room. A thick layer of dust covered everything. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling like macabre decorations. The air was heavy with a sense of forgotten memories. Seth ran his fingers over the dusty surface of the console. It felt cold beneath his touch. He carefully unpacked the console and plugged it in, his hands trembling with anticipation and dread.
Here goes nothing.
He inserted the Nightmare cartridge and flicked the power switch. The screen flickered to life, filled with static and distorted colors. Seth held his breath, his heart pounding in his ears. The title screen appeared. It was a simple, pixelated image of a graveyard bathed in an eerie green light. A blood-red font splashed across the screen to Nightmare.
Let's see what you've got.
A shiver went down Seth's spine as he reached out and pressed start. The game was a first-person adventure set in a dark and gloomy forest. The graphics were crude, almost primitive, but there was a strange realism to the way the shadows moved, to the way the trees swayed in the wind.
I found myself quickly drawn into the game's eerie atmosphere. I controlled my character, a pixelated boy who looked strangely familiar through the dense undergrowth. The only sound was the unsettling music and the crunch of leaves beneath my character's feet.
As Seth ventured deeper into the game, he started to notice strange glitches. Shadows flickered at the edge of the screen. The forest seemed to be closing in around him, the trees twisting into grotesque shapes. A cold shiver ran down his spine. He had the unnerving feeling that he was being watched.
As I reached a clearing, a figure materialized from the shadows. It was tall and skeletal, its eyes glowing an eerie red. I gasped, my fingers instinctively moving to shut off the console. But something held me back. A morbid curiosity. I had to see what would happen next.
Earlier that day, Seth's mom had warned him about the abandoned house.
Stay away from that place, Seth. It's dangerous. People say it's cursed.
She was folding laundry, but her brow was creased with worry.
Mom, it's just an old house. There's no such thing as curses.
He knew that wasn't entirely true. He loved scary stories as much as the next kid, but he didn't want his mom to worry.
Don't be so sure, Seth. Some places hold on to bad memories, bad energy. It's best to leave them undisturbed.
Seth had dismissed his mum's warnings as superstitious nonsense, but now, sitting in the dark, eerie silence of the abandoned house, he wasn't so sure. He remembered the strange feeling he had when he touched the game cartridge. It was as if something dark and cold had seeped into him.
It was just a game, I told myself. Just a stupid game, but deep down a knot of fear twisted in my stomach. This wasn't just a game, I could feel it in my bones.
The skeletal figure moved closer, its red eyes burning into Seth's. The figure spoke, its voice a raspy whisper that seemed to come from inside Seth's head.
You shouldn't be here. This is my game now.
Seth tried to turn away to break free from the figure's gaze, but he found he couldn't move. It was as if he were paralyzed. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. He was trapped, both in the game and in the eerie silence of the abandoned house. The screen flickered, and for a moment, Seth could have sworn he saw the ghostly figure reach out from the static. Its bony fingers seemed to claw at the air, as if trying to break free from the digital world and into his.
Panic surged through me. I had gone too far this time. This was more than just a game. This was real, and I was in way over my head.
Seth knew he had to escape. He had to get out of the game, out of the house, and away from the horrifying figure that haunted both. With a surge of adrenaline, he slammed his hand down on the power button. The screen went dark.
I gasped for breath, my heart pounding against my ribs. I could feel the cold sweat clinging to my skin. For a moment, there was only silence.
Then he heard it, a low chuckle coming from behind him. Seth spun around, his eyes wide with terror. The skeletal figure from the game stood in the doorway, its eyes glowing an eerie red in the darkness. It grinned, a horrifying skeletal grin that stretched impossibly wide across its face.
You can't escape me. You're mine now.
Seth scrambled backward, his eyes searching frantically for an escape, but there was nowhere to go. He was trapped. The figure lunged. Seth screamed. The sound was swallowed by the darkness. Was he pulled into the game, or was the figure pulled into the real world? Maybe it was both.